King Ludwig II stood on the balcony of his unfinished fairy tale castle, gazing out over the Bavarian Alps. The sounds of chisels and hammers echoed in the distance, yet the palace was silent, a monument to a dream that would never be fully realized. Behind him, the grandeur of Neuschwanstein loomed, a personal shrine to his obsession with Wagner's operas, but the world saw only a king consumed by madness. As he sank deeper into isolation, cutting himself off from the very people who relied on him, Ludwig's fantasy came at a staggering cost, both to his kingdom and his life. What drove this monarch to spend $6 million of his people's money on a castle that served no purpose but to fulfill a personal obsession? And what tragic end awaited him in the shadow of his impossible dream? The king's vision. Ludwig II was born to rule, but his true throne was not a kingdom. It was the world of dreams. On August 25, 1845, in the stone chambers of Nymphenburg Palace, a child entered the world who would one day blur the line between reality and fantasy so completely that no one could tell where one ended and the other began. His father, Maximilian II, hoped for an heir who would strengthen Bavaria's position in the fractured German states. What he got was a boy who spent his childhood lost in books about medieval knights and fairy tales. Ludwig grew tall and strikingly handsome, dark hair, piercing blue eyes, a face that could have been carved by the same artists who created the statues he would later commission for his castles. But beauty, as he would learn, could be its own prison. His education was rigorous: Latin, Greek, military strategy, the duties of kingship. Yet young Ludwig's mind wandered during lessons about taxation and treaties. He sketched castles in the margins of his textbooks. He memorized poetry instead of population statistics. His tutors worried. His father grew frustrated. Then, at age 15, Ludwig discovered Richard Wagner. The composer's opera, Lohengrin, changed everything. The story of a swan knight, a forbidden question, a love that could never be. It spoke to something deep within the young prince. Here was a world where beauty mattered more than politics, where emotion trumped duty, where dreams could be made manifest through art. Ludwig attended every Wagner performance he could. He sat in darkened theaters and let the music wash over him like a baptism. Wagner's operas became his religion. The composer himself became something close to a god. When Ludwig's father died in March of 1864, the 18-year-old suddenly found himself king of Bavaria. The crown was heavy. The responsibilities were crushing. But Ludwig had discovered something his father never understood. A king's greatest power was not in treaties or armies. It was in his ability to create beauty, to build monuments that would outlive him, to turn dreams into stone and steel. One of Ludwig's first acts as king was to summon Richard Wagner to Munich. He paid the composer's debts. He funded new operas. He built Wagner a special theater where his works could be performed exactly as the composer envisioned. The Bavarian treasury hemorrhaged money, but Ludwig didn't care. This was what kingship meant to him: the power to make beauty real. The royal ministers watched with growing alarm. This was not how a king was supposed to behave. Bavaria faced threats from Prussia. The economy needed attention. The people needed leadership. Instead, their young monarch spent his days planning elaborate performances and his nights attending them, sitting alone in a private box, lost in worlds of swan knights and Nordic gods. But Wagner's world was not enough. Ludwig needed something more permanent, something that would stand long after the final notes faded. He needed a castle, not a fortress or a seat of government, but a shrine to the very idea of beauty itself. A place where the medieval romances loved could come to life, where he could live inside the operas that had captured his soul. In the Bavarian Alps, near the village of Hohenschwangau, stood the ruins of two old fortresses, Vorderhohenschwangau and Hinterhohenschwangau. Ludwig had spent summers there as a child, exploring the crumbling stones and imagining the knights who once walked those halls. Now, with the full power of the Bavarian crown behind him, he would rebuild them. Not as they were, but as they should have been, as they existed in his imagination. He would call it Neuschwanstein, the new Swanstone, a castle fit for Lohengrin himself. The year was 1868. Ludwig was 23 years old. He had unlimited resources, absolute power, and a vision that would consume the rest of his life. But what he didn't have was any understanding of what that vision would cost: a kingdom in peril. As Ludwig sank into his personal fantasy, his kingdom began to wither under the weight of his neglect. Bavaria in the late 1860s was a nation caught between worlds, too small to compete with the great powers, too proud to surrender its independence. The German states were consolidating under Prussian dominance, and Bavaria's position grew more precarious with each passing year. Ludwig should have been managing this crisis. Instead, he was sketching castle plans. The Prussian-Austrian War of 1866 devastated Bavaria's military and treasury. Ludwig's kingdom had sided with Austria, betting on the wrong horse. When Austria lost, Bavaria was forced to sign a humiliating alliance with Prussia. The treaty cost Bavaria 4 million florins and its military independence. Prussian officers now commanded Bavarian troops. The proud kingdom had become a vassal state in all but name. Ludwig signed the treaty without reading it. He had more important things to think about, like the proper height for Neuschwanstein's throne room, or the exact shade of blue for the bedroom ceiling, which he wanted to match the color of the sky in a particular Wagner opera. His ministers pleaded with him to focus on affairs of state. Ludwig responded by spending less time in Munich and more time in the mountains, away from the politicians and their endless complaints. He couldn't understand why they didn't see what mattered. Beauty mattered, art mattered, dreams mattered. Everything else was just noise. The Bavarian economy was struggling. Agricultural production had declined. Industrial development lagged behind Prussia and the other German states. The treasury faced a growing deficit. What Bavaria needed was investment in infrastructure, railways, factories, modernization. What it got was castles. Ludwig's personal building projects began to drain the royal purse at an alarming rate. First came the renovations at the Munich Residenz, where he spent 200,000 marks creating a winter garden complete with exotic plants and a small lake. Then the improvements to Berg Castle, his lakeside retreat. Each project cost more than the last. Each one served no purpose except to please the king's aesthetic sensibilities. And towering above all these expenditures, both literally and financially, was Neuschwanstein. Construction began in September of 1869. Ludwig had chosen the site himself, a rugged crag overlooking the Pillet Gorge, surrounded by mountains and forests. Remote, isolated, perfect. The location was so inaccessible that building materials had to be hauled up steep mountain paths. The rock itself had to be blasted and leveled to create a foundation. Every brick, every stone, every piece of timber had to be carried to the site by teams of workers struggling up narrow trails. The expense was staggering from the beginning. In the first year alone, construction costs exceeded 300,000 marks. Ludwig's treasury could barely afford it. The king didn't care. He kept adding new features. A throne room modeled after the Byzantine, churches he'd seen in paintings, a singer's hall based on the one in Wagner's opera Tannhäuser, bedrooms with ceilings painted to look like starry nights. Each addition drove the cost higher. His ministers did the math. At the current rate of spending, Neuschwanstein would bankrupt the crown within a decade. They presented Ludwig with reports showing the economic damage his projects were causing. He refused to look at them. Numbers were ugly. Spreadsheets were vulgar. He was building something transcendent, and they wanted to reduce it to columns of debits and credits. The political situation grew worse. In 1870, France declared war on Prussia. Bavaria, bound by its treaty, was forced to fight alongside its former enemy. Bavarian soldiers died in Prussian uniforms, fighting a war their king barely noticed. Ludwig did make one contribution to the war effort. He sent his cousin, Prince Luitpold, to command the Bavarian forces while he remained in Munich, revising the plans for Neuschwanstein's gate tower. When Germany won and the German Empire was proclaimed in January of 1871, Bavaria lost what remained of its independence. Ludwig was still technically king, but real power now rested with the new German emperor in Berlin. Bavaria had become a province, its monarch, a figurehead. Ludwig should have been devastated. His kingdom had ceased to exist as a sovereign nation. Instead, he felt relieved. Fewer responsibilities meant more time for his castles. If he couldn't rule an independent Bavaria, he would at least rule his own private world of beauty and art. Neuschwanstein would be his kingdom, a realm where he answered to no one. By 1873, the castle's walls were rising. Workers swarmed over the construction site like ants, building a monument to a god they would never meet. Ludwig visited constantly, examining every detail, demanding changes, adding new flourishes. The throne room ceiling needed more gold leaf. The east bedroom needed a different style of chandelier. The singer's hall required better acoustics, which meant rebuilding the walls. The costs spiraled upward. 400,000 marks, 500,000, 600,000. The numbers lost all meaning. Ludwig had stopped listening to his minister's warnings years ago. Neuschwanstein had become more than a building project. It had become the only thing in his life that made sense. But the castle was not the only thing changing. Ludwig himself was beginning to transform. The handsome young king who had once charmed his subjects was becoming a recluse. He avoided public appearances. He refused to meet with government officials. He spent his days sleeping and his nights riding alone through the mountains or sitting in his unfinished castle, imagining what it would become. The question was no longer whether Bavaria could afford Ludwig's dreams. It was whether Ludwig could survive them. The dream that demanded everything. Neuschwanstein was more than a castle. It was Ludwig's soul poured into stone, and the cost was beyond imagination. The fortress rose from the mountain like something from a fever dream. White limestone walls, soaring towers, turrets that seemed to pierce the clouds themselves. This was not the practical architecture of a medieval stronghold. This was pure theater, a stage set made permanent, a building designed not for war or governance, but for the act of being looked at and admired. Christian Jank, the original set designer for Wagner's operas, had drawn the first sketches. Edouard Riedel, the royal architect, tried to turn fantasy into engineering. The result was a structure that defied both logic and gravity. Towers balanced on narrow bases. Walls rose to heights that made construction workers dizzy. The whole edifice seemed to float above the gorge, held aloft by sheer stubbornness and unlimited funds. Inside, the castle was even more extraordinary. The throne room occupied 2 full floors, its ceiling soaring 60 feet above a floor that would never hold a throne. Ludwig had planned to install one, but he died before it could be made. The room stood empty, a cathedral without an altar, its walls covered in murals of Christian saints and pagan kings. 6 years of work, 8 tons of gold leaf coating the columns and arches, all for a room Ludwig would use perhaps a dozen times. The bedroom was smaller, but no less extravagant. The bed itself took 4.5 years to complete. 14 carvers worked full-time creating the elaborate oak panels, each one depicting scenes from Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. The ceiling showed the night sky, every star painted in its proper position. The washstand was solid silver. Even the chamber pot was decorated with scenes of swans and castles. Every room told a story from Wagner's operas or medieval legend. The dressing room featured murals of the poet Walter von der Vogelweide. The study showed scenes from the legends of Lohengrin. The Singers' Hall replicated the one from Wartburg Castle, where the legendary song contest had taken place in 1207. Ludwig had never been to Wartburg. He didn't need to. The version in his mind was better than any reality. The numbers grew more grotesque with each passing year. By 1877, construction costs had reached 1,200,000 marks. By 1880, 2,400,000. The Bavarian treasury, already strained by Ludwig's other projects, began to crack under the pressure. Ministers warned that the king was spending the equivalent of 1/6 of the kingdom's entire annual revenue on his personal castles. Ludwig's response was to borrow money. He took out loans from private banks. He sold royal properties. He mortgaged future revenues. When the banks refused to lend him more, he approached his relatives in other German royal houses, begging for funds. Most refused. The King of Bavaria, once the ruler of a proud independent nation, had been reduced to a debtor pleading for cash to finish his toy castle. But the borrowing couldn't keep pace with Ludwig's ambitions. In 1883, he began planning even more elaborate additions. A new gatehouse, an additional tower, a complete rebuild of the kitchens to include the latest French cooking technology. Each plan added another year to the construction timeline, another 1,000,000 marks to the total cost. The castle consumed everything: Ludwig's time, his money, his attention, his sanity. He spent weeks at a time at the construction site, living in the completed rooms while workers hammered and sawed in the unfinished sections. He would stay up all night examining bricks, testing paint colors, moving furniture from room to room to find the perfect arrangement. His servants watched him unravel. The king, who had once been merely eccentric, was becoming something else. He talked to himself in the empty halls. He held conversations with imaginary visitors. He gave orders to build things that couldn't exist, then grew furious when his architects explained the impossibility. Work on Neuschwanstein continued through 1884 and into 1885, but the pace had slowed. The treasury was empty. The workers went unpaid for weeks at a time. Creditors began circling. Ludwig's ministers drew up plans for his removal from power. The king was oblivious. He spent his days planning new rooms, new towers, new fantasies that would never be built. By the spring of 1886, the castle had cost 6 million marks. 6 million marks for a building that served no strategic purpose. That housed no government offices. That couldn't even be used as a residence because half the rooms remained unfinished. The grand staircase stopped abruptly at the third floor, leading nowhere. The throne room lacked a throne. The heating system didn't work. The plumbing was incomplete. Windows were missing. Whole sections existed only as architectural drawings. Neuschwanstein was magnificent. It was also a monument to failure, a symbol of dreams pursued past the point of reason. The castle stood on its mountain crag, beautiful and broken, demanding more than anyone could give. It had taken everything from Ludwig, his wealth, his kingdom, his grip on reality, and still it wanted more. The question was no longer what Neuschwanstein would become. It was what it had already made Ludwig into. Cracks in the facade. The towering walls of Neuschwanstein began to crumble, both in stone and in spirit, as Ludwig's mind frayed. The first signs were subtle. Ludwig had always been eccentric. Now, his eccentricities were hardening into compulsions that even his most loyal servants found disturbing. He reversed his schedule completely, sleeping during the day and living at night. Dinner was served at 2 a.m. Meetings, when he consented to them at all, took place just before dawn. He claimed that he worked better in darkness, that the night was when his mind was clearest. But his staff knew the truth. Ludwig was hiding from the sun, from the world, from anything that might remind him he was still a king with responsibilities. His appearance began to deteriorate. The handsome young monarch who had once cut such a striking figure now let himself go. He gained weight rapidly, his face becoming puffy and swollen. He stopped exercising. His teeth rotted from a diet of sweets and wine consumed at odd hours. He refused to see doctors, convinced they were plotting against him. The paranoia had been building for years, but by 1885, it had become all-consuming. Ludwig trusted no one. He suspected his ministers of embezzling from the royal accounts. He believed his servants were spying on him. He was convinced that his family wanted to have him declared insane and locked away. The tragic irony was that this last fear would prove entirely justified. He surrounded himself with male servants, handsome young men from common families who had no political connections or ambitions. He called them his personal guard, but everyone knew they served a different purpose. Ludwig had never married. His brief engagement to Sophie, the sister of Empress Elizabeth of Austria, had been broken off after months of delays and excuses. Women made him uncomfortable. Men, particularly beautiful men, held his attention in ways he could never fully articulate or perhaps even understand. The servants were sworn to secrecy about what happened in the castle at night. Most took their oaths seriously, but rumors spread anyway. Stories of the king wandering the halls in elaborate costumes, acting out scenes from operas to an audience of confused footmen. Tales of elaborate midnight feasts where Ludwig sat alone at a table set for 12, having conversations with empty chairs. Reports of violent outbursts when something wasn't arranged to his exact specifications. His isolation intensified. He stopped attending state functions entirely. He refused to see his ministers. Government business ground to a halt because the king would not sign documents or make decisions. Bavaria was effectively being run by bureaucrats while its monarch hid in an unfinished castle, lost in fantasies that grew stranger with each passing month. The construction at Neuschwanstein reflected Ludwig's fragmenting mind. His orders became contradictory. He would demand that a room be built one way, then insist it had always been meant to be different. He saw conspiracies in minor construction delays. He accused his architects of deliberately sabotaging his vision. When workers failed to complete tasks he deemed simple, he would scream at them for hours, his face red, spittle flying from his mouth. The castle itself seemed to be falling apart even as it was being built. Cracks appeared in walls that had been finished only months before. The foundation was shifting, causing doors to jam and windows to break. The moisture from the waterfalls in the gorge below seeped into the limestone, creating mold and rot. Neuschwanstein was literally crumbling under its own weight, unable to support the fantastical superstructure Ludwig had imposed upon it. His other building projects spiraled out of control. He started Linderhof Palace in 1869 and kept modifying it until it became a bizarre miniature Versailles filled with grottos, fountains, and a mechanical moon. He began Herrenchiemsee in 1878, another massive castle that was meant to surpass even Versailles itself. Both projects hemorrhaged money. Neither would ever be completed. By 1886, Ludwig owed creditors over 14 million marks. 14 million marks. The Bavarian crown was bankrupt. The king's personal fortune had been exhausted. He had borrowed from every bank that would lend to him and begged from every relative who would listen. He had sold properties, mortgaged revenues, and pawned jewels. Nothing was enough. The castles demanded more. His ministers met in secret. They discussed options. A regency, perhaps, with Prince Luitpold ruling in Ludwig's name while the king recovered from his illness. But recovery implied that Ludwig was sick rather than mad. And what they were seeing went beyond sickness. The king was losing touch with reality itself. He believed the characters in Wagner's operas were real. He thought he could communicate with them. He insisted that Neuschwanstein was inhabited by the spirits of medieval knights who visited him at night. Dr. Bernhard von Guden, Bavaria's leading psychiatrist, was brought in to evaluate the situation. He never examined Ludwig in person. Instead, he collected testimony from servants, read reports from ministers, and compiled a case file. The diagnosis came swiftly: paranoia, megalomania, detachment from reality. In modern terms, we might say Ludwig was experiencing a psychotic break combined with severe depression and possible bipolar disorder. In 1886, they simply called it madness. The legal mechanism was already in place. Under Bavarian law, a king could be declared unfit to rule if medical experts determined he was mentally incapable of executing his duties. A commission of 4 doctors, led by von Guden, signed a declaration. Ludwig II of Bavaria was insane. He must be removed from the throne for his own safety and the safety of his kingdom. Prince Luitpold, Ludwig's uncle, would serve as regent. The castles would be stopped. The debts would be managed. Bavaria would have functioning government again. It was all very rational, very sensible, very necessary. There was just one problem. No one had told Ludwig. The cost of madness. The royal court saw a king slipping further into madness, but Ludwig's fantasy world had already taken on a life of its own. In the spring of 1886, Ludwig was still living in his dream. He spent his days at Neuschwanstein, or Linderhof, wandering through completed rooms and imagining the ones yet to be built. He had no idea that in Munich, documents were being prepared that would end his reign. The commission of doctors had never met him. They based their diagnosis entirely on second-hand reports. Von Guden compiled testimony from servants who described Ludwig's bizarre behavior. The midnight rides through the mountains, the conversations with people who weren't there, the violent rages over trivial matters, the obsessive focus on his building projects to the exclusion of everything else. One servant reported that Ludwig had ordered a dinner table set for 15 people, then spent 3 hours having an animated conversation with the empty chairs. Another described finding the king in the throne room at 4 a.m, dressed in full royal regalia, delivering a speech to an invisible audience. A third told of Ludwig's habit of riding his horse through the castle corridors, forcing servants to scramble out of the way. The most damning testimony came from those who handled Ludwig's finances. The king had spent 7 million marks on his castles, 7 million marks in 17 years. To put that in perspective, the entire Bavarian state budget in 1885 was 42 million marks. Ludwig had consumed 1/6 of a year's national revenue on personal projects, and he was still planning more. He wanted to build a Chinese palace, a Byzantine chapel, a medieval fortress even larger than Neuschwanstein. Where would the money come from? Ludwig didn't care. He would borrow it. He would sell more properties. He would mortgage future revenues. When his ministers told him this was impossible, that he had already mortgaged everything there was to mortgage, he simply stopped listening. Money was a problem for other people to solve. His job was to dream, to create, to build monuments that would outlast him. But the monuments were consuming him. The psychological toll of his obsession had become visible even to those who didn't know him well. His face, once handsome, had become bloated and haggard. He had gained so much weight that his royal uniforms had to be constantly let out. His teeth were rotting, giving his breath a foul odor that servants tried not to notice. He moved slowly, ponderously, like a man carrying an invisible weight. His behavior grew more erratic. He would suddenly decide to visit one of his castles in the middle of the night, forcing his entire household to scramble to prepare for the journey. He would arrive, inspect a few rooms, then immediately order everyone back to Munich without explanation. He spent money on absurd things: a mechanical peacock, a sleigh designed to look like a swan, a full-sized boat meant to be suspended from the ceiling of one of his castles so he could pretend to be sailing through the stars. The line between Ludwig and the characters in his beloved operas had blurred beyond recognition. He sometimes referred to himself as the Swan Knight, Lohengrin's title in Wagner's opera. He talked about his friendship with the medieval Minnesinger Tannhäuser as if the man were still alive and visiting regularly. He claimed to be building Neuschwanstein for future generations of nobility who would appreciate its beauty, but he never specified who these people were or when they might arrive. His letters from this period reveal a mind in chaos. He wrote to his cousin Elizabeth, Empress of Austria, describing visions he'd had of angels descending into the throne room at Neuschwanstein. He penned long, rambling missives to Wagner about operas that should be written, though the composer had died in 1883 and could not respond. He sent instructions to his architects that contradicted themselves from one sentence to the next, demanding that rooms be both larger and smaller, darker and lighter, more ornate and more simple. The servants who remained loyal to Ludwig tried to shield him from the growing crisis. They kept news of the mounting debts from reaching him. They intercepted letters from creditors. They lied about the state of construction at his castles. telling him work was proceeding smoothly when in fact it had slowed to a crawl for lack of funds. But they couldn't hide everything. In early June of 1886, Ludwig learned that a commission had declared him insane. The news reached him at Neuschwanstein, delivered by a loyal servant who thought the king should be warned. Ludwig's reaction was telling. He didn't deny the accusation, didn't defend his sanity, didn't argue that he was fit to rule. Instead, he simply asked how long he had before they came for him. The answer was not long at all. A delegation had already been dispatched from Munich to arrest him and transport him to Berg Castle, where he would be held under medical supervision. Prince Luitpold would assume the regency. Bavaria would move forward without its mad king. Ludwig spent his final days of freedom at Neuschwanstein, the castle that had consumed his life. He wandered the completed rooms, running his hands over the walls he'd ordered built, the furniture he'd personally selected, the murals he'd commissioned. This was his legacy, not the kingdom he'd inherited, not the political achievements he'd never pursued. This pile of limestone and gold leaf and broken dreams. He knew, in whatever part of his mind remained clear, that he would never see Neuschwanstein completed. The castle would stand half-finished, a monument to visions that exceeded the capacity of reality to contain them. Future generations might marvel at its beauty. They might make it a tourist destination. They might turn it into exactly the kind of public spectacle Ludwig had been trying to escape. But they would never understand what it meant to him, how the castle was not just a building, but an entire world. A place where beauty triumphed over ugliness, where art mattered more than politics, where a king could be something other than a disappointing symbol of a dying era. The cost of this world had been everything: his kingdom, his fortune, his sanity, and soon it would cost him something even more precious: his life, the point of no return. The dream could no longer be contained. It began to suffocate the man who created it. June 10th, 1886. The delegation arrived at Neuschwanstein. 4 men climbed the mountain path to Ludwig's fairy tale castle. A government commission led by Baron von Washington, accompanied by doctors and police officers. They carried the legal documents declaring Ludwig insane and unfit to rule. Their mission was simple: take the king into custody, transport him to Berg Castle, ensure he could no longer damage himself or his kingdom. Ludwig knew they were coming. His loyal servants had warned him. In the hours before the delegation's arrival, he made frantic plans to resist. He ordered the local fire brigade to defend the castle. He instructed his staff to bar the gates. He even considered fleeing to Austria, where his cousin Elizabeth might protect him. But in the end, he did nothing. He simply waited. When the delegation reached Neuschwanstein's gates, they found them locked. The castle staff, following Ludwig's orders, refused entry. Baron von Washington produced his legal documents and demanded access in the name of the Bavarian government. The servants didn't budge. For several hours, there was a bizarre standoff. The representatives of the new regime camped outside the gates while the mad king remained inside, surrounded by the only world that made sense to him. The local police, loyal to Ludwig, arrested some members of the delegation. The situation was spiraling toward chaos. Here was the government of Bavaria, unable to apprehend its own king. Here was a monarch whose only defenders were a handful of servants and provincial police officers. The absurdity would have been funny if the stakes weren't so high. Eventually, the delegation retreated to the nearby town of Hohenschwangau to regroup. They sent word to Munich of their failure. Prince Luitpold, already installed as regent, was furious. Orders came back. Try again. Use force if necessary. Bring Ludwig to Berg Castle by whatever means required. But something had shifted. The first attempt had given Ludwig time to think, to understand what was happening, to realize that this was the end, not just of his reign, but of his entire world. Once they took him from Neuschwanstein, he would never be allowed to return. His castles would be frozen in their current state of incompletion. His dreams would die with his freedom. On June 12th, a larger delegation returned. This time they were prepared for resistance. They had more officers, better legal documentation, and they had convinced the local police to stand down. There would be no defense of the castle, no last-minute rescue. Ludwig's fairy tale was over. The king did not resist when they finally entered. He had spent the night burning documents, destroying correspondence he didn't want found, personal letters, financial records, things he wanted to keep private. Then he dressed in his finest clothes and waited for them to come. Dr. von Gudden, the psychiatrist who had diagnosed Ludwig without ever meeting him, was part of this second delegation. He approached the king with professional detachment. Ludwig looked at him with something between contempt and pity. This man, who knew nothing of beauty or art or dreams, had the power to declare a king insane. The irony was not lost on Ludwig. The formal reading of the declaration was brief. Ludwig II of Bavaria was declared mentally unfit to rule. Prince Luitpold would serve as regent. Ludwig would be placed under medical care at Berg Castle for his own protection. He had no right to appeal, no recourse, no escape. Ludwig's response was calm. Too calm, according to witnesses. He simply nodded and said he would go peacefully. He asked only for time to pack a few personal belongings, books, clothes, some letters from Wagner, the small remnants of a life that had been consumed by castles. They took him down the mountain under guard. The journey from Neuschwanstein to Berg Castle took several hours. Ludwig sat in the carriage, looking out at the Bavarian countryside he would never rule again. He was 40 years old. He had been king for 22 years. Now he was a prisoner. Berg Castle, where they held him, was one of his family's properties. He had spent happy summers there as a child, swimming in Lake Starnberg and exploring the woods. Now it was his jail. Von Gudden took charge of his care, which consisted mainly of keeping him isolated and observing his behavior for signs of further mental deterioration. Ludwig was not allowed visitors. His correspondence was monitored. His servants were replaced with medical staff who reported everything he said or did to von Gudden. He was a specimen now, a case study in royal madness. The psychiatrist made notes about his patient's mood swings, his expressions of grandiosity, his detachment from political reality. But Ludwig was not completely broken, not yet. He still had one thing they couldn't take from him, his dignity. He refused to act like a madman for their benefit. He was polite to the staff, cooperative with the doctors. He ate his meals. He slept. He behaved in every way like a perfectly sane man who happened to be imprisoned in his own castle. Von Gudden found this frustrating. His diagnosis required Ludwig to be obviously insane. But the king he observed at Berg Castle seemed merely depressed and defeated. Where was the raging megalomaniac from the servants' reports? Where was the man who talked to empty chairs and believed he could communicate with medieval ghosts? The truth, which von Gudden never understood, was that Ludwig's madness had never been the violent, obvious kind. It was subtler, a gradual withdrawal from one reality into another, a preference for dreams over facts, an obsession with beauty that had grown until it consumed everything else. You couldn't diagnose it in a few days of observation. You had to watch it unfold over years, but there would be no years. Ludwig had been at Berg Castle for less than 2 days when everything changed. June 13th, 1886. The day that would define Ludwig's legacy forever. The day that would turn a deposed king into a legend. The day that would ensure Neuschwanstein became not just a castle, but a mystery. The day Ludwig II died, the fall of the Mad King. On June 13th, 1886, Ludwig was found dead, but the mystery surrounding his death would haunt his legacy. The official story was simple, too simple, which is why no one has ever really believed it. According to Dr. von Guden's report, Ludwig requested a walk on the evening of June 13th. The weather was mild, the king had been cooperative. Von Guden saw no reason to refuse. They set out together around 6:30 in the evening, walking along the shore of Lake Starnberg near Berg Castle. Von Guden dismissed the guards who normally accompanied them on such walks. He wanted to observe his patient in a more natural state, away from the stress of constant supervision. That decision would cost both men their lives. When they didn't return by 8 o'clock, the staff began to worry. By 9, they organized a search party. They found both men in the shallow water of the lake around 10:30 at night. Ludwig was floating face down, his coat soaked through. Von Guden was nearby, showing signs of a violent struggle. His face bore scratches and marks consistent with someone fighting for their life. The water where they found the bodies was only waist deep. Both men were strong swimmers. Neither had any reason to drown in such shallow water. The official verdict came swiftly. Ludwig had committed suicide by drowning. Montiftetsaxon, Guden had tried to stop him and been killed in the struggle. The case was closed. The Mad King had taken his own life rather than face a future of imprisonment and disgrace. But the official story had problems, serious problems. First, the autopsy. Ludwig's lungs contained no water. He hadn't drowned. The actual cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, which could mean anything. A heart attack, shock from cold water, or something else entirely. The autopsy report was suspiciously brief and was kept sealed for decades. Second, the scene itself. If Ludwig had wanted to commit suicide, why choose such shallow water? Why not walk out into the deeper parts of the lake where drowning would be certain? And if he was trying to escape, as some theories suggest, why head into the lake at all rather than into the surrounding woods? Third, von Guden's injuries. The doctor had been 62 years old, but he was found with defensive wounds suggesting a fierce fight. If Ludwig had merely been trying to drown himself, why would von Guden bear such marks? If they'd struggled, why were there no similar injuries on Ludwig's body? Fourth, the missing evidence. Several witnesses reported hearing gunshots from the direction of the lake around the time of the deaths. Those reports were dismissed without investigation. A fisherman claimed to have seen 3 figures in the water, not 2. His testimony was ignored. A coat belonging to Ludwig, found on the shore with what appeared to be bullet holes, disappeared from evidence before it could be properly examined. The theory that formed immediately and has never been disproven is simple. Ludwig was murdered, perhaps by von Guden himself, who may have tried to sedate the king with an injection and provoked a fatal struggle. Perhaps by assassins hired by the government who wanted to ensure the deposed king could never return to power. Perhaps by agents of Prussia who saw Ludwig as a potential rallying point for Bavarian independence. The truth died with the two men in the lake. What we know with certainty is this: Ludwig II, King of Bavaria, died under mysterious circumstances less than 48 hours after being declared insane and removed from power. The speed with which he was buried, the secrecy surrounding the autopsy, the suppression of witness testimony, all suggest a cover-up. Whether the cover-up hid murder or merely a bungled suicide attempt, we may never know. The Bavarian government moved quickly to control the narrative. Ludwig's body was brought back to Munich and displayed briefly for the public. Thousands came to pay their respects. The man they had mocked as the Mad King was suddenly transformed into a tragic figure, beautiful even in death, his face peaceful, showing no signs of struggle or fear. The funeral was elaborate, the kind of spectacle Ludwig would have appreciated. Black horses, solemn music, church bells tolling across Munich. He was buried in the crypt at St. Michael's Church, alongside his ancestors. The Swan King laid to rest among the rulers who had understood duty in a way he never could. But even in death, Ludwig could not escape controversy. His brother Otto, who had shown signs of mental illness even more severe than Ludwig's, was technically next in line for the throne. But Otto was clearly unfit to rule. So Prince Luitpold continued as regent, governing Bavaria in the name of a king who was locked in an asylum under the shadow of a king who had died in a lake. The question of what really happened on the shore of Lake Starnberg became an obsession for some. Conspiracy theories multiplied, each one more elaborate than the last. Ludwig had been shot and his body placed in the lake. Ludwig had faked his death and escaped to Austria. Ludwig had been poisoned and thrown into the water. The lack of concrete evidence allowed every theory to flourish. What got lost in all the speculation about Ludwig's death was the question of his life. What had driven him to such isolation? Why had he preferred fantasy to reality so completely? Was he truly insane? Or was he simply a sensitive soul crushed by the demands of a role he never wanted and could never fulfill? The castles he left behind offered some answers. Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee. Each one revealed something about the man who built them: his need for beauty, his fear of intimacy, his desire to create worlds he could control completely. They were not the monuments of a madman. They were the work of an artist trapped in a king's body, a dreamer forced to live in a world that had no patience for dreams. The Bavarian government wasted no time in capitalizing on Ludwig's greatest creations. Within weeks of his death, they announced that Neuschwanstein would be opened to the public. The castle that had nearly bankrupted the kingdom would now save it. Tourists would pay to see the Mad King's fantasy. The very thing Ludwig had built to escape the world would become one of the world's most famous attractions. The irony would have destroyed him. The aftermath. Ludwig's death may have closed one chapter, but it opened another for the kingdom and for Neuschwanstein itself. 7 weeks after Ludwig drowned in Lake Starnberg, Neuschwanstein opened its doors to paying visitors. 7 weeks. The king's body was barely cold in its tomb when Bavaria began profiting from his obsession. The decision was purely economic. Prince Luitpold's government inherited a financial catastrophe. Ludwig had left behind debts of 14 million marks. The royal treasury was empty. Creditors were demanding payment. Something had to be done, and quickly. The castles represented the largest tangible assets the crown possessed. Why not turn them into revenue generators? On August 1st, 1886, the first tourists climbed the mountain path to Neuschwanstein. They paid 2 marks each for the privilege of seeing what had driven a king to madness. They walked through the incomplete throne room. They stared at the elaborate bed Ludwig had commissioned. They stood on the balcony where he had gazed out at his kingdom and wondered what it must have been like to need beauty so desperately. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands came in the first month, tens of thousands in the first year. People from across Europe made pilgrimages to see the Swan King's castle. They came out of curiosity, out of morbid fascination, out of a genuine appreciation for Ludwig's aesthetic vision. The reasons didn't matter. What mattered was that they came, and they paid. The Bavarian government was surprised by the demand. They had expected some interest, but this was beyond anything they'd imagined. They quickly moved to open Ludwig's other castles to the public as well. Linderhof began receiving visitors. Even Herrenchiemsee, which was barely a third complete, started offering tours. The revenue rolled in. Within 5 years, the tourist income from Ludwig's castles had paid off a significant portion of his debts. Within 10 years, Neuschwanstein alone was generating enough money to cover its own maintenance costs, plus a healthy profit. The castle that had nearly destroyed Bavaria was now saving it. But the financial success came with a price. To accommodate the crowds, the castle had to be modified. Railings were installed to prevent tourists from touching the walls. Ropes cordoned off certain areas. The fragile murals and tapestries were protected behind glass. Neuschwanstein, which Ludwig had built as a private sanctuary, became a public museum. The transformation was both practical and tragic. Practical because it preserved the castle for future generations. Tragic because it turned Ludwig's most personal creation into exactly what he had been trying to escape: a spectacle for the masses, a commodity to be bought and sold, a theme park avant la lettre. The tours themselves shaped how people understood Ludwig's legacy. The guides told a specific story: a sad king, a beautiful dreamer, a tragic figure consumed by his own magnificence. They carefully avoided the more uncomfortable aspects of his life: his sexuality, his political failures, the economic devastation his projects caused. Instead, they focused on the romance, the mystery, the fairy tale elements that made good copy. This sanitized version of Ludwig's story became the dominant narrative. He was the mad king, yes, but mad in a poetic way, mad like an artist or a visionary, not mad in the clinical sense that would make visitors uncomfortable. The tour guides turned him into a character from one of his beloved operas: noble, doomed, beautiful in his tragedy. The myth of Ludwig II began to grow beyond the facts. People claimed to see his ghost walking the halls of Neuschwanstein at night. They reported hearing Wagner's music drifting from the empty throne room. They invented stories about his final days, each more dramatic than the last. The real Ludwig, complex and troubled, disappeared beneath layers of romantic fantasy. Meanwhile, his family tried to move forward. Prince Luitpold continued as regent for Otto, the younger brother who would never be sane enough to rule. Otto lived in isolation at Fürstenried Palace, his madness far less poetic than Ludwig's. He talked to invisible spirits. He attacked his servants. He had to be physically restrained during his worst episodes. Where Ludwig had escaped into beauty, Otto had simply escaped. The Bavarian government worked to repair the damage Ludwig's spending had caused. They modernized the economy. They invested in infrastructure Ludwig had ignored. They joined Germany more fully, accepting that Bavaria's days as an independent power were over. It was a practical government for a practical age. Everything Ludwig had despised. But even as they moved forward, they couldn't escape his shadow. Neuschwanstein was becoming too famous, too important. The castle that represented everything wrong with Ludwig's reign was now Bavaria's greatest asset. Tourism was becoming a major part of the economy, and tourists came primarily to see what the Mad King had built. The paradox was complete. Ludwig had spent his kingdom's fortune building monuments to escape the world. Now those monuments were bringing the world to Bavaria in unprecedented numbers. He had wanted privacy and gotten immortality. He had wanted isolation and created a pilgrimage site. Everything he built to hide himself had become a spotlight that would shine on him forever. The incomplete state of the castle added to its appeal. Tourists loved that the throne room had no throne, that the kitchens were unfinished, that whole wings existed only as blueprints. It proved the story. The Mad King, cut down before his dream could be realized. The tragedy was more marketable than any triumph could have been. By the turn of the century, Neuschwanstein was receiving over 50,000 visitors per year. The number would only grow. Each generation discovered Ludwig anew. The Romantics saw him as a kindred spirit. The Modernists viewed him as a critique of 19th century excess. The Postmodernists appreciated the ironic tension between his intentions and his legacy. And through it all, the castle stood, magnificent and incomplete, a dream frozen in stone, a monument to the cost of beauty. Every visitor who climbed that mountain path was, in some way, completing Ludwig's vision. He had wanted to build something that would outlast him, something that would prove beauty mattered. He had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams and failed in exactly the way he most feared. The castle had become immortal, but at the cost of becoming the very thing Ludwig built it to oppose: the legacy of a dream. The castle that nearly destroyed a kingdom would become a symbol of hope and a fantasy for millions. By the 1930s, Neuschwanstein had transcended its origins as a king's folly. It had become something larger, an icon, a symbol that meant different things to different people but resonated with everyone who saw it. The Nazis recognized its propaganda value immediately. They photographed it constantly, using it in tourism campaigns designed to showcase German cultural superiority. Hitler himself visited, though he reportedly found it too theatrical for his tastes. The irony of the Third Reich appropriating a castle built by a king who hated politics and avoided government would have amused Ludwig if he'd lived to see it. During World War II, Neuschwanstein served a grimmer purpose. The castle's remote location and numerous rooms made it ideal for storage. The Nazis used it to hide art stolen from across Europe. Paintings that had hung in French museums, sculptures taken from Polish palaces, treasures looted from Jewish families. All of it passed through Ludwig's fairy tale castle, turning it into a warehouse for cultural plunder. American soldiers discovered the stolen art when they liberated Bavaria in 1945. They found the throne room stacked with crates, the singers' hall filled with canvases wrapped in protective cloth. Rooms Ludwig had designed for beauty, now holding beauty stolen from others. The castle that had cost a kingdom its fortune had become a bank vault for a regime that would destroy far more. After the war, Neuschwanstein returned to its role as a tourist destination, but now it carried additional layers of meaning. It was a survivor, a structure that had outlasted the king who built it, the kingdom that paid for it, and the dictatorship that exploited it. Each regime had tried to use the castle for its own purposes. The castle remained indifferent to politics, beautiful regardless of who claimed to own it. The late 20th century brought new transformations. Neuschwanstein became one of Germany's most visited tourist sites. Over 1 million people per year made the pilgrimage by the 1980s. The ET numbers kept growing: 2 million, 3 million. By the early 21st century, nearly 1.4 million visitors annually climbed the mountain to see Ludwig's dream. The sheer volume of tourists created problems Ludwig could never have imagined. The castle began to deteriorate from foot traffic. The murals faded from camera flashes. The floors wore down. The air itself, filled with the breath and body heat of millions of visitors, damaged the delicate frescoes. Preservation became a constant battle. The castle that Ludwig had bankrupted a kingdom to build now required millions in annual maintenance just to survive the crowds it attracted. But the most significant transformation came not from Germany, but from America. In 1955, Walt Disney opened Disneyland in California. The park's centerpiece was Sleeping Beauty's castle, designed in obvious homage to Neuschwanstein. Disney had visited Bavaria and been enchanted by Ludwig's creation. He saw in it the perfect embodiment of fairy tale architecture. The connection between Neuschwanstein and Disney would reshape both their legacies. For most Americans, and increasingly for people worldwide, Neuschwanstein became known primarily as the inspiration for Disney's castle. The original had inspired a copy, and the copy had become more famous than the original. Ludwig's intimate expression of personal obsession had been transformed into a corporate logo, a symbol of mass entertainment, everything he had despised. Yet there's a strange appropriateness to this final irony. Ludwig had built Neuschwanstein to be a stage set brought to life. Disney built his castles to be permanent stage sets. Both men understood the power of manufactured fantasy. Both believed that architecture could transport people to other worlds. Both were willing to spend whatever it took to realize their visions. In this sense, Disney was Ludwig's spiritual successor. The difference was that Disney turned his obsession into a profitable empire while Ludwig's obsession destroyed him. The castle's influence extended beyond theme parks. It appeared in countless films, from World War II dramas to romantic comedies. It became shorthand for European castle in popular culture. Travel posters featured it. Chocolate boxes displayed it. Jigsaw puzzles reproduced it. Neuschwanstein achieved the ultimate modern immortality. It became a cliché. Scholars and historians tried to push back against the simplified narrative. They published books about the real Ludwig. They emphasized the political and economic context of his reign. They explored the complexity of his sexuality and psychology. They wanted people to understand that Neuschwanstein was more than just a pretty castle. It was a symptom of profound personal and political dysfunction. But their efforts made little impact on the popular imagination. People didn't want complexity. They wanted the fairy tale, the mad king who built a castle in the clouds, the dreamer who sacrificed everything for beauty, the romantic figure who died mysteriously in a lake. The real story, with all its messy details about debt and politics and mental illness, couldn't compete with the myth. And perhaps that's fitting. Ludwig himself preferred myth to reality. He lived in the worlds of Wagner's operas rather than the world of Bavarian politics. He chose beauty over responsibility, fantasy over fact, dreams over duty. His greatest creation reflects that choice. Neuschwanstein is fundamentally theatrical, fundamentally unreal. It looks like what a castle should look like according to someone who learned about castles from stories rather than history. The castle's very imperfection, the fact that it remains incomplete, adds to its power as a symbol. It represents not what was, but what might have been. Not reality, but aspiration. Every visitor who sees those towers rising above the Alps is seeing both what Ludwig achieved and what he failed to achieve. The monument to his obsession and the monument to his defeat. By the early 21st century, Neuschwanstein generated over 15 million euros annually in tourism revenue. 15 million euros every year from a castle that cost the equivalent of $6 million to build. The investment Ludwig's ministers had decried as fiscal insanity had become one of the most profitable pieces of real estate in Germany. The castle had outlived its creator by more than a century. It had survived 2 world wars, multiple political upheavals, and countless predictions of its destruction. It stood as a rebuke to everyone who thought dreams were worthless, as a reminder that sometimes the impractical, the excessive, the obsessive can create something that endures long after more sensible ventures have crumbled to dust. Ludwig would have hated knowing that millions of people walk through his private sanctuary every year. But he might have appreciated knowing that his castle had become immortal, that it would stand as long as the mountains themselves, that his dream, ridiculous and excessive and ruinous as it was, had achieved a permanence that all his political achievements never could. The castle as a commodity. Neuschwanstein was no longer just a king's fantasy. It became a profitable symbol for the masses. The transformation of Neuschwanstein from personal shrine to commercial product represents one of history's most successful repurposings of royal excess. What began as a monument to one man's escape from reality became a cornerstone of Bavaria's tourism economy. The marketing of Neuschwanstein started crude and became sophisticated. Early postcards from the 1890s showed simple photographs with captions about the Mad King's castle. By the 1920s, tourism boards were creating elaborate promotional materials, emphasizing the romance and mystery. By the 1950s, Bavaria had developed a whole industry around Ludwig's legacy. The Bavarian government, initially embarrassed by Ludwig's excesses, learned to embrace them. The king who had once been seen as a source of shame became a brand. Royal Bavarian castles tours sprung up, offering packaged visits to Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, and Herrenchiemsee. Hotels near the castles traded on Ludwig's name. Restaurants offered Mad King Ludwig-themed menus. The entire region around Füssen reoriented its economy around a single building and the tragic figure who built it. The numbers tell the story. In 1886, Neuschwanstein generated modest admission fees from curious visitors. By 1900, it was bringing in 50,000 marks annually. By 1950, the figure had climbed to 300,000 marks. By 2000, annual revenue exceeded 15 million euros. The castle that cost $6 million to build had repaid that investment dozens of times over. But the commodification went beyond simple tourism. Neuschwanstein's image became ubiquitous. It appeared on beer steins and snow globes, on posters and calendars, on luggage tags and refrigerator magnets. Every souvenir shop in Bavaria carried Neuschwanstein merchandise. The castle's distinctive silhouette became as recognizable as the Eiffel Tower or the Statue of Liberty. Disney's adoption of the design in the 1950s supercharged this process. Suddenly, Neuschwanstein wasn't just famous in Europe, it was known worldwide. American tourists who might never have heard of King Ludwig II flocked to see the real Disneyland castle. The relationship became symbiotic. Disney's popularity drove tourism to Neuschwanstein. Neuschwanstein's authenticity added legitimacy to Disney's fantasy. The castle appeared in films and television shows with increasing frequency. Directors used it as shorthand for European royalty and romance. It showed up in Nazi-themed thrillers, romantic comedies, and documentaries. Each appearance reinforced its status as an icon. Each use further separated the building from its historical context and transformed it into a floating signifier that could mean whatever the viewer wanted it to mean. Ludwig himself became a commodity. His life story was told and retold, each version shaped by current cultural preoccupations. In the 1920s, he was a romantic figure crushed by the modern world. In the 1960s, he became a symbol of sexual liberation, his rumored homosexuality reinterpreted as brave nonconformity. In the 1990s, he was a cautionary tale about mental illness and the dangers of isolation. Each era found in Ludwig a reflection of its own concerns. The Bavarian Palace Department, which manages Neuschwanstein, walks a careful line. They must preserve the castle's historical integrity while accommodating mass tourism. They must maintain the building's fairy tale appearance while acknowledging its troubled origins. They must satisfy visitors who want to see a Disney castle while educating them about the real human cost behind the fantasy. The tours themselves have been refined over decades. They last exactly 30 minutes. They move visitors through a predetermined route designed to maximize throughput while minimizing damage to the structure. Guides recite a standardized script that hits the emotional high points. Ludwig's obsession with Wagner, his mysterious death, the castle's unfinished state. The facts are accurate but carefully curated to support the preferred narrative. What gets left out is revealing. The tours mention Ludwig's debts, but not the specific families ruined by his borrowing. They note his eccentricity, but gloss over the clinical details of his mental deterioration. They acknowledge his isolation, but avoid the implications of his relationships with male servants. The real Ludwig, messy and complicated, remains hidden behind the romantic facade. This sanitization serves a purpose. Tourists don't want to hear about the economic devastation, or the political incompetence, or the possible sexual abuse of subordinates. They want the fairy tale, and the fairy tale sells. It sells admission tickets and souvenirs and hotel rooms. It generates revenue that supports preservation efforts and employs thousands of people. The myth has become more valuable than the truth. The castle's incomplete state, once a source of embarrassment, became a selling point. Marketing materials emphasize what wasn't finished: the missing throne, the unused rooms, the unrealized plans. Incompleteness implies tragedy, and tragedy enhances the romantic appeal. A completed Neuschwanstein would be impressive. An incomplete Neuschwanstein is poignant. Modern Bavaria has fully embraced this legacy. The region's official tourism slogan for years was "Land of Castles," the implication being that Ludwig's obsessive building, which nearly bankrupted the kingdom, had created an asset that now defined the region's identity. The king who failed at governance had succeeded at creating something more valuable than any successful government could have managed. The economics are irrefutable. The castle generates more revenue than it consumes. It employs hundreds directly and thousands indirectly. It attracts visitors who spend money throughout the region. It has put a small Bavarian town on the global map. By any practical measure, Ludwig's dream has been vindicated. His ministers were wrong. The investment wasn't wasteful. It just took a century to pay off. But this vindication comes at a cost Ludwig would have found intolerable. His castle belongs to everyone now. His private sanctuary has become the world's backdrop. The place he built to escape the masses is now defined by them. The Mad King's enduring mystery. Even as Neuschwanstein stood as a testament to Ludwig's dream, the mystery of his life and death remained unsolved. More than a century after his death, Ludwig II continues to provoke questions that have no satisfying answers. The most persistent mystery is also the most obvious. How did he really die? The official account has never convinced anyone who examines it closely. Ludwig drowned in waist-deep water, no water in his lungs, von Guden showing signs of a violent struggle, witnesses reporting gunshots, a coat with possible bullet holes that disappeared from evidence. The autopsy report sealed for decades. Every element suggests something other than simple suicide. Theories have proliferated over the years, each championed by researchers who believe they've finally solved the puzzle. The most common explanation is murder orchestrated by the Bavarian government. According to this theory, Ludwig represented a threat even in captivity. He had supporters among the common people. He had connections to other European royal houses. As long as he lived, there was a chance he could be restored to power. The solution was elimination disguised as suicide. Evidence supporting this theory includes the suspicious timing. Ludwig died less than 2 days after being declared insane. Barely enough time for him to process what had happened, let alone formulate an escape plan. The speed suggests premeditation. The government wanted him gone before he could mount any resistance or appeal to foreign powers for help. Then there's the matter of the witnesses who reported gunshots. Multiple people in the area heard shots coming from the direction of the lake around the time of the deaths. Their testimony was never properly investigated. The authorities dismissed it as hunters or firecrackers. But the consistency of the reports is hard to ignore. At least 3 separate witnesses, none of whom knew each other, reported hearing the same thing. A variation on the murder theory focuses on von Guden himself. Perhaps the psychiatrist decided to end Ludwig's life as a mercy killing. Or perhaps he tried to sedate the king with an injection. Ludwig resisted, and in the struggle both men ended up in the water. This would explain von Guden's injuries and Ludwig's lack of water in his lungs. Death by injection rather than drowning. Other theories veer into more elaborate territory. Some researchers claim Ludwig faked his death with help from loyal servants. That the body pulled from the lake was a double. That the real Ludwig escaped to Austria or Switzerland, where he lived out his days in anonymous obscurity. These theories require complex conspiracies involving dozens of people, any one of whom could have exposed the truth. They persist nonetheless, fed by the romantic notion that Ludwig deserved a better ending. A darker set of theories focuses on Ludwig's sexuality. Rumors about his relationships with male servants had circulated for years. In the repressive moral climate of late 19th century Bavaria, such relationships carried enormous stigma. Some researchers argue that Ludwig was murdered not for political reasons, but to prevent the exposure of scandal that could damage the reputation of the entire royal family. This theory aligns with the destruction of Ludwig's personal papers. In the days after his death, many of his letters and diaries disappeared. What survived was carefully edited. The destruction suggests someone wanted to hide something, sexual indiscretion seems a likely candidate. The medical question adds another layer of mystery. Was Ludwig actually insane? The doctors who diagnosed him never met him. Their evidence came entirely from secondhand testimony provided by servants and officials who had their own motivations for wanting Ludwig removed from power. Modern psychiatrists who have reviewed the available evidence offer conflicting opinions. Some argue Ludwig clearly suffered from schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. His grandiose behavior, paranoia, and detachment from reality fit the diagnostic criteria. Others counter that his symptoms could be explained by severe depression, combined with social anxiety and the crushing pressure of a role he never wanted. Eccentric behavior and poor judgment don't automatically equal insanity. There's also the question of whether Ludwig's supposed madness was consistent. Servants who spent time with him in his final years reported both bizarre behavior and perfectly lucid moments. He could be discussing elaborate fantasies one hour and managing complex architectural decisions the next. This pattern doesn't fit neatly into any single diagnosis. The political context complicates everything. Bavaria's government had strong incentives to declare Ludwig insane. His spending threatened the treasury. His isolation prevented effective governance. His refusal to marry meant no direct heir, creating succession problems. A diagnosis of insanity solved all these issues. It let them remove him from power while maintaining the fiction that they were acting in his best interest. But financial motives aside, there's substantial evidence that Ludwig was genuinely unwell. His behavior became increasingly erratic in the years before his deposition. He spent nights riding through the mountains alone, sometimes in dangerous weather. He had violent outbursts over trivial matters. He held conversations with people who weren't there. These aren't the actions of a man in full control of his faculties. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Ludwig was mentally ill, but not to the degree his enemies claimed. He was functionally capable in many ways, but deeply impaired in others. He needed help, but not necessarily removal from power. The tragedy is that no one tried to help him. They simply took his crown, and 2 days later, his life ended under circumstances that will never be fully explained. Modern investigations using contemporary forensic techniques have been proposed multiple times. Exhume the body. Conduct a proper autopsy. Use modern forensics to determine the actual cause of death. Test for poisons or drugs that 19th century doctors wouldn't have detected. Each proposal has been blocked by the Bavarian state and Ludwig's surviving relatives. The official position is that the case is closed. The dead should rest in peace. This refusal to allow new investigation only fuels more speculation. What are they hiding? What would a modern autopsy reveal that the state prefers to keep secret? The conspiracy theories multiply with each denied request. Perhaps the mystery is the point. Perhaps Ludwig's unclear death is the final, perfect expression of his life. A man who lived between reality and fantasy, dying in a way that allows both to coexist. We can believe he was murdered. We can believe he committed suicide. We can believe he tried to escape. The evidence permits all these narratives while confirming none. The mystery ensures Ludwig remains interesting. A king with a clear, documented death would be just another historical figure. A king who died mysteriously in a lake becomes an eternal enigma. The uncertainty transforms him from a person into a legend, and legends, unlike people, can never truly die. The price of a dream. The towering spires of Neuschwanstein still rise above the Bavarian Alps, a constant reminder of the price paid for a king's vision. Stand at the base of Neuschwanstein today and look up. The white limestone walls still gleam against the mountain stone. The towers still reach toward the sky with the same impossible elegance Ludwig demanded. The castle still looks like something from a dream, because that's exactly what it is. But dreams have costs. Understanding Neuschwanstein means understanding what Ludwig paid for this monument to beauty, and what his kingdom paid, and what continues to be paid by everyone who tries to separate the fantasy from the reality. Ludwig paid with his sanity, or rather, his obsession consumed what sanity he had. The line between artistic vision and mental illness became impossible to draw. Did his castles drive him mad? Or did his madness express itself through the castles? The question has no answer because the two became inseparable. The buildings were extensions of his mind, and his mind became a reflection of the buildings. As Neuschwanstein grew more elaborate, Ludwig's grip on reality weakened. Each new room, each added tower, each design revision took him further from the world of politics and responsibility into a realm where only beauty mattered. He paid with his kingdom. Bavaria never recovered from the financial strain of his building projects. The $6 million spent on Neuschwanstein alone, combined with the costs of his other castles, created debts that outlasted his reign. The Bavarian treasury was bankrupted. The kingdom's independence was compromised. Real power shifted to Prussia while Ludwig played with stone and gold leaf. By the time he died, Bavaria was a kingdom in name only. His obsession with creating a private world had cost his people their public one. He paid with his life, whether murdered or drowned, whether killed by conspirators or by his own desperation. Ludwig died at 40. He should have had decades ahead of him. Instead, he got 22 years as king and one final walk beside a lake. The castles he built to give him immortality instead became his tomb. He's buried in Munich, but his ghost lives in Neuschwanstein. The building that was supposed to be his sanctuary became his monument. But Ludwig wasn't the only one who paid. His workers paid in sweat and danger. Men died building Neuschwanstein. They fell from scaffolding. They were crushed by falling stones. They developed lung disease from working with limestone dust. Their names don't appear in the guidebooks. They're not mentioned on the tours, but they paid for Ludwig's dream with their bodies. The Bavarian people paid an opportunity cost. Every mark spent on castles was a mark not spent on schools or hospitals or infrastructure. While Ludwig decorated throne rooms, Bavarian children attended overcrowded schools. While he installed elaborate fountains, Bavarian roads went unrepaired. The entire kingdom was sacrificed to one man's aesthetic obsession. Future generations have paid in a different way. They've paid with the truth. The real Ludwig, complicated and troubled and human, has been replaced by a sanitized fairy tale. The Mad King, the Dream King, the Swan King. These romantic labels obscure more than they reveal. They let us avoid confronting the reality of mental illness, financial irresponsibility, and the damage one person's unchecked power can cause. Tourism pays its own price. The castle that Ludwig built for solitude now hosts over 1 million visitors annually. The fragile murals deteriorate under the assault of camera flashes and body heat. The floors wear down under millions of footsteps. Preservation efforts fight a losing battle against the sheer volume of human traffic. Neuschwanstein is being slowly destroyed by the very popularity it generates, but there's another side to this accounting because for all the costs, Neuschwanstein has also paid dividends. It preserved something Ludwig valued above all else: The belief that beauty matters, that art has worth beyond its practical application, that human imagination, even when excessive and destructive, can create works that transcend their origins. The castle has given millions of people something to wonder at, something to aspire to, something to remind them that the world contains more than just the practical and the profitable. Every person who stands at the base of those towers and looks up experiences a moment of awe. In our cynical age, awe is increasingly rare. Neuschwanstein provides it in abundance. It has vindicated, in a strange way, Ludwig's belief that beauty could be worth any price. Not because beauty is more important than people's welfare or fiscal responsibility, but because beauty can outlast the regimes that create it, can transcend the circumstances of its creation, can mean different things to different generations, while remaining fundamentally itself. Neuschwanstein has survived 2 world wars. It has outlived the kingdom that built it. It has endured through political systems that would have horrified Ludwig, and through cultural changes he could never have imagined. The castle remains incomplete, impractical, excessive, magnificent, all the things Ludwig was. The final accounting is this: Ludwig spent $6 million building Neuschwanstein. That investment has generated hundreds of millions in tourism revenue. By purely economic measures, the castle has been an extraordinary success. Ludwig's ministers were wrong. His vision, ruinous in the short term, proved profitable in the long term. But economic success misses the larger point. Neuschwanstein matters not because it makes money, but because it makes people feel something: wonder, sadness, awe, confusion about how something so beautiful could emerge from something so tragic. The castle forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about ambition and obsession, about the relationship between genius and madness, about whether great art requires sacrifice, or whether that's just a story we tell ourselves to justify the damage artists do. Ludwig built Neuschwanstein to escape the world. Instead, he created a monument that would force every generation to grapple with his choices. The castle stands as both achievement and warning, as proof that dreams can become real, and that dreams becoming real can destroy the dreamer. The price of Ludwig's dream was paid by everyone around him: his family, his kingdom, his workers, his own sanity and life. But what he purchased with that price endures. Not just a building, but a question that every visitor must answer for themselves. Was it worth it? Can beauty justify the cost? Should we admire Ludwig's determination or condemn his selfishness? There are no easy answers, which is perhaps fitting. Ludwig himself lived between easy answers, in a space where beauty and madness intertwined, where dreams and delusions couldn't be separated, where the price of perfection was paid in currencies that can't be measured in money alone. Neuschwanstein stands above the Bavarian Alps, permanent and incomplete, monument and mystery, achievement and failure, dream and nightmare. A castle built on obsession, a legacy written in stone and blood, and unpaid debts and tourist revenue and unanswerable questions. The towering spires still rise toward the sky, and they will rise long after we're gone. The Mad King's dream, outlasting the dreamer, outlasting the kingdom, outlasting even the memory of what it cost. That, in the end, might be the truest measure of the price. We remember the beauty. We forget the pain that created it. Until we stand at the base of those impossible towers and try to calculate what they truly cost, and find that the sum can never quite be settled.